Sarunas biedrs šodien divkārtējais olimpiskais čempions Sebastians Ko, kurš šobrīd ir arī Starptautiskās vieglatlētikas federācijas, jeb World Athletics prezidents. Ar viņu pārunāsim gan rudenī gaidāmo skriešanas pasaules čempionātu Latvijā, kā arī runāsim par Latvijas vieglatlētikas situāciju šobrīd un tās finansējumu, kā arī sarunas trešajā daļā apspriedīsim Baltkrievijas un Krievijas atlētu pielaišanu vai nepielaišanu Olimpiskajām spēlēm. Bet par visu pēc kārtas. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Great pleasure.
As I understand, this is not your first time in Latvia.
It's not. I was here, I think, about 20 years ago.
Was it in incognito sort of situation?
No, I was coaching a young Australian athlete who came here to race over 800 meters.
Right.
I came to watch the race and to advise, and that was my first, but it was my only visit to Riga. But I guess that was in about 2003, something like that.
Some things have changed during this time.
A lot has changed, both politically and structurally.
Right. So, but at first we're going to talk about the first World Athletics Road Running Championships.
Yes.
That's going to take place in Riga, and for the first time ever in such a capacity.
Yes.
Yeah. So 1 mile, 5 kilometers, half a marathon championships. People are going to become world champions here in Riga.
Yes.
Why such a format for the first time?
Well, it's really an extension of an existing world championship that we have, which is the World Half Marathon. And we changed the format for the World Half Marathon in around 2010, because it was just an elite race, but we wanted a mass participation content. We've done that very successfully. We've had 3 or 4 of those editions. But we looked at it and thought, well, why don't we make a festival over the course of a weekend rather than just a one-off race? Why don't we include the 5,000 meters, the 5K, which is the most universally run distance for people on the road, and then the mile, which may not be understood in every country on the planet.
We have kilometers here.
but it has a real history to it. And it's not just a Commonwealth history. We've had Moroccans and Algerians that have held, and Americans that have held that record. And the mile is a really sort of an iconic distance. Mm-hmm. But in each of those 3 races, we are going to do something quite unusual, which is to give the opportunity for local people, and we hope international running tourists, to come and run with the elite. Some of them will be Olympic champions, and to have a world championship medal in a mass competition. And we think that's probably the first time any sport has been able to offer that.
Right, so in theory, anyone can participate and become a world champion.
As long as they sign up.
Right.
They can't just turn up on the day. That would be a little bit of a challenge, but there will be plenty of notice, and the local organising committee, which is a really good organising committee here, will direct people to the right websites and the right way to sign up. But this will be history, and I'm delighted that Riga is the first of our new formats. We want to develop it every year, but we were very impressed during the bid. There were 13 cities that bid for this originally, but we were impressed in 2 key areas. The first was the experience of the local organising committee that had done so much with the Riga Marathon, which had really grown in stature. It's one of our gold label races. It's the premier marathon in the region. Right. But we also were really taken by the vision that the teams had for embedding the race and the weekend amongst local communities.
Right, because we know Riga Marathon has been going on for many years now, and it has become a festival of sorts in Riga. So we should expect something like that, but on a bigger scale?
I hope so. But look, I'm not micromanaging the organising committee. We had very good meetings with them yesterday. They're making really good progress. I know my teams at headquarters in Monaco are very happy to be working with this team. They have a track record of delivering great events, so I'm absolutely sure that this will be one of the great events. And actually, at the end of the year, we really want to be able to say that Riga is the road running capital of the world.
Okay, we'll see. Any star runners we should expect?
Well, we're beginning to understand what the fields look like, but we've already had indications that there will be about 40 countries with elite competitors that have shown an interest in this. And of course, we're not just narrowing it down to our elite competition. We want athletes, runners, participants from around the world that love running to also want to be here.
All right, let's talk about athletics in Latvia. I talked to my colleagues in our sports department, and the first thing actually they said, now when everyone is preparing for Olympics, they are talking about these standards that are being put out for the athletes, which can bring you to Olympics. And I don't need two hands to count Latvian athletes who can fulfill these standards. And then we talk about, are our athletes so weak or are these standards so high? And if it's the latter, then why?
The standards are high because certainly in a World Championship, I'm not going to focus on the Olympic Games for a moment because that's a very different structure with quotas, and we get given a certain number of places to fill for the athletics component of an Olympic Games. It's around about 1900. So in the World Championships, we have two systems that run side by side. We have our world ranking lists, which is the points gained from performances over the course of the year. And we also have standard selection. So it's a 50-50 model. And my instinct is that we want at a World Championships, and we don't have that many opportunities to showcase the sport, we do want us to be able to say that the best of the best are competing. Now, yes, I agree. Some of those standards are quite high. And our competition commission will always maintain a weather eye over all that. But at the moment, I think we've got the balance about right. Let me just be really clear. This is not about the weakness of Latvian athletics. There's a lot happening here. This is a great federation that are doing a wonderful job, probably on not huge public funding. I mean, I would like to see that funding increase because they really are a very, very good team. And Latvian athletes have been absolute stars of our sport in the past, so we will do everything we possibly can to help.
Well, let's talk about Latvian Athletics Association. During the past few years, there's been talk about the decline of athletics in Latvia. If we look at the sporting results, if we look at the organization as such, the fact that the capital of Latvia for many years has not had a quality athletics arena has been a sad joke going around. I don't know, is there anything the International Federation can do, will do, to get the Latvian athletics back on track?
Well, one of the reasons I'm here is not just to promote the World Road Running Championships at the end of the year, September the 30th to October the 1st, to be precise.
Yes.
It is also to be here to support the ambitions and aims of Latvian athletics and through its federation. For instance, yesterday I sat with some of the project managers who took me through the time frame for the stadium and some of the funding challenges we have there. I'm actually meeting the Prime Minister this afternoon, so who knows, that subject may come up on the agenda. But it is, look, I'm absolutely unashamed when I say this, that you do not get excellence in any sport unless you have the right level of funding, because the right level of funding allows you to appoint world-class coaches. It allows you to have a world-class federation, which they do, and it allows you to do so many things because you have that funding and you can build for the future. You know, if you're really always scrapping for funding, then it's quite hard to take even a medium-term view. So those will be the messages when I meet with the Minister for Education, and then I hope the Prime Minister later today.
From your perspective, where this funding should come from?
It's got to be a mixture of all sorts of things. You know, some of that funding comes from World Athletics. It's not a life-changing sum of money, but it's important. Some of it obviously comes directly through from government, so the distribution of that. And actually, you know, I will always make this case about athletics, that you're not just funding an elite sport. Athletics, I think, has a unique ability to meet some of the challenges, political and social challenges, that all governments confront, particularly around the health and well-being of populations. Let me give you a really good example of that. We're not just wanting a mass participation race in Riga on September the 30th, October 1st, simply because it makes us look good and we have lots of people out there running. There is actually a much more fundamental principle that sits behind that. And if you look at the mission of World Athletics, it's very clear. It is to use athletics and the voice of the athletes in the ambition for a healthier and fitter world. And we take that very seriously. So the broader point I would make is that if you fund athletics, you're not just funding the medals table, you're actually funding what I think is a very effective arm of social policy, social cohesion. Our coaches are working 24/7 with particularly athletes in challenged communities. And you can, if it is used properly, really change the nature of national fitness.
If somebody would come to you and ask, tell us, is there a country, for example, where they have gotten this balance of financing from private, from country, from the government, from local municipalities, from anywhere else, which we should look up to as an example to follow?
I can give you some good examples, and a couple are closer to home here. Finland, a few years ago, had one of the highest cardiac disease rates certainly in Europe and in large parts of the world. Mass participation, sports policy has helped change that around alongside clinical and medical practice. There are good examples. Switzerland is a very good example of good level of state funding, but commercial sponsorship, and also the club structure. So, for instance, the best one-day track meeting in the world, the Weltklasse at the Letzigrund Stadium in Zurich, every penny that is made by that meeting goes back into the local athletics club. So there's a good virtuous circle of funding. So there are good examples of that. I was very impressed with some of the work that's taking place in South Africa at the moment around that, particularly in social cohesion and nation building.
I talked to, before this interview, I talked to some youth coaches in Latvia, athletic coaches, and they pointed to one problem, that you have kids participating in different fields of athletics, but then about that time when they have to move out of their parents' apartments, about 18 years of age, this is the crisis point. What should we do? Like if you take football or hockey or something like that, there is a system. Well, from youth sports, you go to semi-pros or pros or universities. For Latvian coaches, they say this is a problem here in Latvia at least. What should the 18-year-old athletes should do? Well, those not world class maybe, but those who show some promise.
Well, it's difficult for me to be specific about the Latvian system, but this is not an unusual problem that you have posed. one of the, and it's a challenge that we have looked at and we continue to look at World Athletics. The highest attrition rate in our sport is actually between the ages of 18 and 21. So I'll give you a sobering statistic. Those athletes winning even gold medals at a World Junior Championship are statistically unlikely to even be competing for their national team as a senior athlete in 2 or 3 years' time. Now, there are a number of reasons behind that. First of all, coaches will tell you that that is probably the toughest period to coach an athlete from being a very good junior into a senior. And that's not just about physicality, that's about mentality. Sometimes it's about the need in some communities to actually find a job. Athletics is not one of those sports where you automatically have the opportunity to go and play for a Premier League football club, right, or a professional football club, or even some of the more professional leagues. We've tried to address that by increasing prize money, certainly at the World Championships. We've tried to address that by creating more opportunities for athletes to compete. We have something called the Continental Tour, and we now have almost trebled the number of Continental Tour races over the course of a 2 or 3 year period. So all these are aimed at trying to give the athletes, and unashamedly again, more opportunity to build some financial security from the sport.
Right.
But at the moment, we need to really address that, and that will be a combination of support, as we've said, from government to make sure we have the right infrastructure. Then you want the support from the commercial sector, and that is always going to be a challenge, particularly at the moment, because the macroeconomic climate is a challenging one. But you're right, I mean, you've also got athletes that rely quite heavily on their educational institutions and parents. Parents will always be the biggest sponsors any athlete has, even when they become well known and have their own commercial sponsorships. I doubt, I probably only got to about the age of 26 or 27 where the funding that I was getting from my sponsors matched anything like the funding that I got from my parents from the age of 11 or 12 through until I first went to an Olympic Games. So you're quite right, it is a very delicate balance. And one of the things that we can address in the sport is the number of opportunities we are creating for athletes to actually compete. And because they're competing more often, and we hope they're doing well, the larger opportunity there is to actually earn some money doing it.
So basically your message to the young athletes in Latvia would be, do the sports, go into the athletics, but not if your main reason is to earn big checks in future.
I would say that to anybody going into sport, because if they're only going into sport because actually they want to earn lots of money, that's probably not going to end well. Right. I don't think any young athlete sets off in any sport only because they see on the back page of a newspaper that footballers are earning £300,000 or £400,000 a week. I don't genuinely believe it works like that.
Well, that's the story about parents, but that's a different story.
Yeah, that is.
Right.
That is, but overwhelmingly, the one thing that athletics has got very well is we have very, very supportive parents. And they're not pushing their kids into athletics because it's a big money-making machine. Right. If they're pushing their kids into athletics, it's probably because they understand the sport. They may have even practiced it themselves, and they think it's an environment that they want their children to be in.
Right. The last question about the money. In Latvia, as everywhere in the world, I guess, the king of the sports is football, and the athletics is the queen of the sports, right? That's at least what people say here in Latvia. When we look at the sports federations here in Latvia, that we clearly can see that one of the federations who can afford the most to build new stadiums, new pitches and stuff like that is the Football Federation, of course. We know that the financing they get from UEFA and FIFA is quite large for Latvian standards. If we look in this sense, if the king can provide their local federation quite a lot, what's the situation with the athletics?
Well, we're not football. We're not FIFA. We have good finances, certainly much, much stronger since I became president of the sport, but we're not awash with money. And it would be wrong of me to sit here and pretend that we are going to be able to change the course of the fortunes of a federation simply by funding. We have our own fundraising sponsorship programs, and I've always been clear that we want to be able to fund member federations as well as we possibly can. We are a confederation that represents member federations, so the end user is the member federation here. And so it has to be my ambition to be able to give a greater level of funding all the time to our federations. We then would expect, as we do, accountability and seeing that money spent well. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you we're FIFA. We're not. We're not in the position to build tracks or infrastructure. And one of my messages is always, whenever I travel, it's not just to sit with sports ministers. With all due respect, they don't really always have the purse strings. I need to get that message that actually athletics is something worth investing in. And the relationships that we form with governments and with political leadership around the world is as important, and in some environments more important, than the relationships we have commercially.
Okay, let's turn to the last topic, the Russian-Belarusian athletes. I know that internationally it depends on where you go. Some might look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a local conflict, not in this region, as you probably might guess. This is very hot, very sensitive topic, and that's why I have to ask you about it. IOC has suggested that the Belarusian and Russian athletes should participate, maybe under white flag or in other capacity. What's the stance of World Athletics on this?
It's very clear. Russian athletes remain and Belarusian athletes remain suspended from our World Championship competitions. We made that decision last February. But if you remember, we have two twin challenges. The first is that the Russian Federation, Athletics Federation, has been suspended since
2015.
2015. And it wasn't suspended because of passports or politics or political leaderships. It was suspended because of the egregious attack on the integrity of our sport with state-sponsored doping. And that is now well recognized. It appeared in the WADA papers, our own work that we did. And so we created the task force. It's chaired by somebody of inestimable ability in this space, a Norwegian called Rune Andersen. And slowly but surely, with some twists and turns, and some years we've gone back rather than forward, we're approaching the point where the task force in March at our next council meeting will recommend that it is time for either the Russian Federation to be reintroduced to our sport because they have reached the reinstatement plan, or they may turn around and say, no, they're not ready. I don't ever prejudge what they say because it's an independently chaired group, and we've always accepted the recommendation.
So no indications?
No, no indications at all. I mean, if you take the words of the report from the last task force, which was to our last council meeting in Rome before Christmas, Rune Andersen was very clear that they'd made good progress, that they felt there was a cultural shift. We had two independent people from World Athletics and the Athletic Integrity Unit that now sits in on those reinstatement programs. But I don't ever prejudge. I don't know what the task force will report. But then and only then can we then move on to the next issue which will be about the suspension of Belarusian athletes and Russian athletes because of the invasion of Ukraine.
So some might say that, well, by saying let's talk only about doping now, let's not talk about war, you are ignoring that.
No, be absolutely clear. We're not ignoring that. We were the first federation to suspend Russian and Belarusian athletes after the invasion of Ukraine. So it be very clear, they are, until the council decides otherwise, suspended, and they have been for the last year.
Should it be good for sports if these discussions about should we allow them, should we not allow them, end as quickly as possible? Because if we look at the IOC stance, there is no answer to that right now.
No, and this is not a straightforward issue. And my council will want to make a judgment as to whether the principles by which they suspended the Russian Federation, the Russian athletes, which were actually the neutral, because they were suspended anyway. We only had athletes from Russia competing in our World Championships in a neutral status anyway. Right. So it was the neutral status that we suspended. The Belarusian athletes we did suspend because of the aggressive position that Belarus had taken in this. So again, we are very process driven in the sport, more so than any other sport, and probably more so than the International Olympic Committee. It is very important that we discuss, and we will discuss that, and you've only got to wait barely 2 weeks for that decision. There's
been some talks about boycotting the Olympic Games. And when I know your background, that you won your Olympic medals in 2 Olympics that were boycotted by some of the countries. If you were like American citizen, you wouldn't have had the first 2 Olympic medals, right? Because they boycotted.
Well, I was a British citizen.
Exactly.
And if I hadn't fought my own government, I probably wouldn't have gone there anyway.
Right.
But unlike the Americans, we were living in a proper prime ministerial democracy at the time,
right.
And the Prime Minister gave her opinion, but the National Olympic Committee, which has always been independent from government, said no. We will send our athletes there. There won't be the Union flag, there won't be national anthems, we won't be involved in the opening ceremony. But I am fundamentally opposed to boycotts, if that's the question you're about to ask.
Well, that was the thing that I wanted to ask you, that you are in this very unique position, that you can look at the situation from both sides. You've been competing, you've been winning Olympics as an athlete, but you've also been chairman of London Olympic Games. So you can see this situation from both sides. What is your first reaction when you hear about people talking
I'm
about
sorry,
boycotts?
I may be slightly myopic here. I only see it from one side.
Okay.
Boycotts are historically illiterate, and they don't actually achieve what they set out to do other than to damage the athletes. The issue at the moment is a profoundly complicated one, and it is one that individual countries and individual athletes will make a decision about. But the boycott of an Olympic Games is not something I will ever support.
Why?
Because it doesn't achieve what it sets out to achieve. It never does. It actually only damages the athletes.
The last question, you already mentioned that you were very quick to respond to a war in Ukraine, and World Athletics set up a special fund for Ukrainian athletes. I've read about 200 euros have been donated to at least to more than 100 Ukrainian athletes. Has that fund achieved what it was set out to do?
Absolutely it did. And it fundamentally allowed the athletes that were dispossessed of their facilities, those that were training overseas at the time, it has given them the funding to maintain the semblance of training programs. It's not, again, they're not life-changing sums of money, but if you speak to the Ukraine Federation, which I do every few days, I met with them just recently at the European Indoor Championships in Istanbul. They think that this has made a big difference, and we will do the same this year as well.
What's the influence of Russian money in world athletics?
Nothing.
Because again, this topic is probably more on people's minds here than anywhere else in outside of this region. But when we look at the Olympic Games awarded to Russia or FIFA World Cup awarded to Russia with afterwards some scandals, and then we see the president of Ice Hockey Federation, who has been staunch supporter of Russia, becoming Russian citizen after leaving the post, there are questions about the Russian money's influence in the sports, because we know that it's sort of sports washing, as it's called, or
I'm not
something like that. But in the world athletics, Russian money, no influence.
No. No sponsors, no funding, no events.
And before the 24th of February?
No.
No.
No, not for the length of time that I've been president of the sport.
All right. Okay, that's it from me. Is there anything you want to say to our viewers?
Yes, please turn out on September the 30th for the festival. Sign up now, whether it's for 1 mile, for the 5K or the half marathon. You will be making history. This is the first of this type of championship. And we want this to be the benchmark. So we need you out there.
Will you be back for them?
I will certainly be back for those.
You actually ran today, this morning,
I did
right?
run. I ran the championship course this morning.
And what's the first impressions?
Well, I'm hoping that when I come back here in September that there isn't snow on the ground and it's slightly warmer.